Thank you, Janie, for your kind words, and also thank you so much for inviting me to stay for a month in Australia. I really look forward for my research in Japanese garden in Australia. So if you have any tips, just let me know afterwards. I rely on information from all sorts of people. And actually, yes, it goes back for many times. Actually, what Janie asked me was to talk about Japanese erotic art. And she was doing a really interesting series on erotic art. And just to reminisce for a moment, I thought I was just going to talk about a bunch of fine art students in a small seminar room. But luckily I wasn't the first one, and the one before was erotic art on India, and it was Pasanita. And I went there, and oh my God, there was a huge lectures, the largest lecture theatre in Oxford, and there was a emeritus professor of anthropology, the professor of Sanskrit, they were all sitting there. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? And then I thought, I know, if I'm going to talk erotic manga, nobody would know anything about it, and I was totally right. It was great fun. Okay. Now today's topic. Now, the Japanese garden must be one of the most widely recognized icon of Japanese culture. Any tourist visiting Kyoto, for example, would include at least 2 or 3 of the old Japanese gardens, even for a day trip. The two most famous Japanese gardens for us are undoubtedly that of Ryôanji Temple on your left, and that of the Katsura Detached Palace, both in Kyoto, and both created before the 20th century. Ryōanji seems to represent the deeply thoughtful Zen culture on the one hand, and Katsura a highly sophisticated aesthetic sensibility on the other. Today, I should like to concentrate on the story of Ryōanji Garden, but also like to say that the garden of Katsura Palace has a closely related and near identical story, which we will touch upon briefly later. The purpose of my talk is to examine the historiography of the reception of Ryōanji Garden, and I should like to argue that the exceptionally high reputation of the garden of Ryōanji was only a product of the early 20th century, and that significantly and rather paradoxically, modernism was instrumental in putting this much older cultural product on the high pedestal. Methodologically, this is an attempt to see the phenomenon of the Japanese garden beyond the normal discussion of it as an eternal symbol of old Japan by emphasizing the fluidity of its interpretation, and while doing so, to examine the process of transnational canon formation, the subtitle of my talk today. Now, I should like to take a brief break from the story of Ryōanji and discuss my subtitle, The Process of Transnational Canon Formation, just mentioned. For various reasons, canons are getting a rather bad press from critical art historians these days. However, the canon seems to be also very resilient and is refusing to go away. Should we aim for a canonless art history? Is that desirable or even possible? I think not. In order to clarify the process of canon formation, I should like to introduce a concept I tentatively call value system circle. I gave a short paper on this at the CIHA Nuremberg Congress in July last year, which Janie mentioned. But for today, I should like to give a very short summary of this. Canons are based on value systems. This artwork is good, but the other one is poor, and finally, this is the best. What I should like to propose is that we should examine the value systems which create these canons. The canon is a manifestation of a value system, but then how could we characterize a value system? Importantly, a value system belongs to a community which shares it. I should like to call it a circle. both for its encircling character and also for its connotation of a group of people with shared interests. Our value system circle does not have a perfect round shape and the edges could be fuzzy. However, it does demarcate a territory of in and out. If you are in, you share the values, and if you are out, you do not. The second meaning of a group of people with shared interests indicates that a value system could play a more active role, as for example found in a stamp collector's circle. The sharing of values will bring like-minded people together, but their active sharing will exclude those outside the circle. A stamp collector's circle could enthuse on a rare stamp, but those outside often cannot understand what they are talking about because they don't share the value system. Much of the debate on the canon has been about Foucauldian unequal power relationships. However, I should like to look at it for a change from a point of view of sharing values, the sense of belonging created within a value system circle. You probably never thought that you could hear today that the canon could be a positive, did you? But in a way, that is exactly what I am saying. Writings by anthropological and sociological scholars such as Pierre Bourdieu, James Clifford, and Nicholas Thomas gave me the idea of this value system circle. Also, the debate relating to Margaret Mead clearly shows that the value system circle of a particular village does get affected by an anthropologist joining them in their village life. Both the village people and the anthropologist change by that particular experience of life together. I wanted to expand this idea into art history by examining the value system relating to the canon. Here, the best recent literature for me is a 2007 book, Partisan Canons, edited by Anna Brzezinski, Duke University Press. It becomes clear that a canon is not something fixed forever, though at times it tries to be, but something which has to negotiate its position constantly, changing its character while doing so. We have not one canon, but many competing with each other. She's looking for the mechanics of the canonical system and importantly distinguishes between the structure and its contents. So do I. She talks about the production of local canons, which is, in my view, created within each of the local value system circle. However, I also differ in a number of points from her approach. She talks about canon's claim to be transcendent status, but from my perspective, this happens only within each value system circle. The structure of canon formation is not always negative. It could be enriching. If a yellow circle overlaps with a blue one, we will get green, thus changing the overall nature of both circles. We, even art historians, cannot escape from daily acts of evaluating artworks. One of the lessons Foucault and Said have taught us is that we are not immune from the value systems we live in. We inhabit a world where power relationships matter, and many of these relationships are of an unequal kind. However, this does not mean that we are just mechanical slaves of these relationships. The important point is that we should be aware of these, reflect on these, and act as best as we can within a given constraint. This may be a rather modest aim, and also not an easy one, but is essential for fruitful transnational interaction to happen. What I should like to do for the rest of today is how this canon formation is functioning in our example of Ryôanji Garden. As we will see, there is a quite complex overlapping of multiple value system circles, and somehow from the densest patch of overlapping, The canon of Ryôanji rises like a phoenix at the epitome of Zen, the most canonical work. I should like to begin by contrasting the current reputation of the gardens of Ryôanji with that of the period before the 1920s. Then I will examine the story and the critical context of how this garden attained the canonical status during the period of the 1920s and 30s, and then how this gets even more accelerated during the 1950s and up to the 1970s. From about the 1980s, a new revisionist view questioning the canon of Ryôanji and Katsura starts to appear, some even claiming incomprehension of seeing any aesthetic value in these canonical gardens. First, I should like to introduce briefly the Ryôanji garden, which is rather enigmatic in many ways. We don't know when it was made and who designed it. The dates suggested among the scholars veer from the 15th to the 17th century, though the latter date is finding more favors by recent scholars. This is actually quite amazing, because 15th century will be seen as the height of Zen culture in Kyoto, so it makes sense. The 17th century, well. Also, what it represents is not quite clear. In general, it is regarded now as the epitome of Zen art, a visual representation of the Zen idea, but garden history expert Isuya Shinji doubts whether the dry gardens hitherto so much associated just with Zen could be explained just by Zen. More on this later. Nevertheless, Ryôanji Garden is world famous as a Zen garden, attracting about 300,000 annual visitors. I took that picture when there were some constructions going on, but the tourist flow cannot be stopped, so still we were let in. In survey-type art history books in English, Katsura Detached Palace is very popular. Right. For example, in A World History of Art by Hugh Honor and John Fleming, published in 1982, perhaps the best of these traditional world art survey books, Katsura is the only example of a Japanese garden design, though the text itself talks only about the architecture and not the garden. Another book, Japanese Art by John Stanley Baker, which is one of the most widely available general survey books on Japanese art, has in its revised edition, which I have on 2000, illustrations of Ryôanji and Katsura, but also just one more, the Tenryūji garden, also in Kyoto. In general, for us, Ryôanji and Katsura seem to represent not only the pinnacle of Japanese garden design, but also that of Japanese culture. What was it like then before the 1920s? It shows a very different picture. The most famous and respected book on Japanese garden published in English is probably the book Landscape Gardening in Japan by Josiah Konda, published in 1893 in Tokyo. I should like to point out in our context that in the supplement to this book, published in the same year, it's the one underneath the first book, Konda does mention these two gardens, but crucially illustrate neither Ryôanji nor Katsura. Over 100 pictures, but no Ryôanji and Katsura. In fact, the general neglect of Kyoto gardens in this publication is astonishing. He includes only 6 plates from Kyoto, and the vast majority of the photos are from Tokyo, with examples also from Aomori, Niigata, and Kagoshima, among others. The canon of the Japanese garden provided by Konda is seriously at odds with that of our age. Recent studies have shown that Konda's book is highly dependent on Tsukiyama Teizoden, commentary on landscaping and garden design, a famous Edo period garden design manual, and also on Zukai Teizouhou, Illustrated Garden Design Guide by Kinkichiro Honda, published in 1891. This means that the Tokyo-centric view and the relative neglect of Ryōanji and Katsura gardens were not an eccentric one by Honda only, but shared by some of the Japanese experts of the time. What is happening here is that the value system circles of post-1930s and that of pre-1920s do not seem to overlap much as regard to the canonical status of Ryōanji and Katsura garden. But Josiah Konda and the Japanese experts of pre-1920s seems to inhabit the same value circle. During the 1920s and 30s, there is a distinct change in how Japanese gardens are evaluated both in Japan and the West. The Gardens of Japan by Jiro Harada, published in 1928 in London, contains still a substantial amount of Tokyo gardens, perhaps more than a survey of this kind would do nowadays, thus showing a larger overlap with the value system circles of the previous period. However, Kyoto now plays a dominant role, and both Ryōanji and Katsura are illustrated. Then, during the 1930s, the Hawaii-based American writer and garden designer Loren E. Koch emerged as a new champion of the Japanese garden, and in particular of Ryōanji garden, published a series of books on Japanese gardens. Right? Her 1935 book, 100 Kyoto Gardens, published in London and Kobe, has 2 black and white photos of Katsura, but boasts a rare early color plate and a black and white one of Ryōanji. Her 1940 book, The Art of Japanese Gardens, published in New York, though the remit has widened from just covering Kyoto to the whole of Japan, the number of plates on Ryōanji increases to 3. And there you go. And in her 1957 catalogue of an exhibition of photographs of Japanese gardens at the University of Oregon at Eugene, one of the only 3 illustrations is Ryōanji. In her final, and probably the most popular book, The World of the Japanese Gardens at the time, published by John Weatherhill in 1968, there are 6 illustrations of Ryōanji, including one in snow and one taken from the back of 2 rocks, not normally visible. What's the point? Yeah, it's very strange. Right. That one at the top. Here also, the garden of Takaian in Kyoto is illustrated, but for the sole purpose of claiming the success of Ryōanji garden at the expense of, in her view, poorly designed Takaian garden. One also the good design, bad design idea. This is bad design, that is good design. So poor Takaian has been shipped in to be a bad guy. But the way it should be noted that The Art of Japanese Garden was published in 1940 in New York, at a time when it would be assumed that the entire USA was hostile to anything to do with Japanese culture. In 2010, the Research Center for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, TRAIN, at the University of the Arts London, completed a large 3-year research project called Forgotten Japonism, the taste for Japanese art in Britain and the USA, 1920s to 1950s. And one of our most startling findings was that the US attitude to Japanese art and culture during the war period was not universally hostile. As Koch's publication also proves, it seems that a taste for Japanese art was maintained by many Americans on the basis of, we do not like the Japanese, but we love Japanese art. And rather similar to some English people I heard to say, I love France, but wish the French weren't there. A US value system circle of appreciating Japanese art was not entirely destroyed by the war. Right, let us examine the turning point a bit more in detail. Shoji Yamada has written a detailed account of the reception of Ryōanji Garden in his book, Shots in the Dark, Japan, Zen, and the West, published by the University of Chicago Press, which is a revised edition of his original Japanese edition entitled Zen to yu nano Nihonmaru, the Japan ship named Zen, published in 2005. Yamada states that it was the American Lauren Koch who for the first time identified Ryōanji Garden as a Zen garden in her book 100 Kyoto Gardens, mentioning it as an esoteric temple garden, and that the creator of this garden was a follower of Zen. Strangely, Yamada gives the date as 1936, but there is an early edition from 1935, which I had in my hands recently, which would strengthen Koch's claim to be the first to say Ryōanji Garden is Zen. Yamada refers to Wiebe Keutert's research, which established that this notion of Ryōanji Garden as a representative garden of Zen Buddhism is only recent and probably originated in the 1934 publication Essays in Zen Buddhism by the famous proselytizer of Zen in the West, Daisetsu Suzuki. In this context, Lauren Koch was very early in arguing the Zenness of Ryōanji already in 1935, and Yamada suspects that this came not from Mirei Shigemori, we are going to talk about him later, but from Daisetsu Suzuki, to whom Koch was also close. In fact, they were neighbors when she was staying in Kyoto between 1932 and 1935, and of course also Suzuki's wife, Beatrice Lane, was an American. They must have a lot of chats together. Yamada further states that the Houses and People of Japan by the German architect Bruno Taut, written in 1936 but published in 1937 in English, Ryōanji and Zen were combined together when a caption, I quote, an embodiment of the Zen spirit, end of quote, appeared under a photograph of Ryōanji Garden. It is clear that Taut admired Zen and also Ryōanji Garden, but in his extensive writings on Japan, this caption, according to Yamada, is the only time these two appear together. He examines the circumstantial evidence in detail and suggests that these do not give clear proof that Zen and Ryōanji would have naturally been considered together by Taut or those around at the time when he was in Japan, and raises a possibility that this could have been inserted by the editor of the book without Taut's permission. This is highly likely, as Taut started writing the draft for this book on 23rd of January 1935, but by the time the English edition published by Sanseido, a Tokyo publisher, appeared, he was in Turkey, and it was not clear how far he was involved with the editing of this book. As we have seen, by 1997, the idea of Ryōanji as a or even the Zen garden becomes gradually more prevalent. You may feel that I'm splitting hair by chasing the exact date of when Ryōanji Garden was called a Zen garden. So let us sit back a bit and see what this all means. This detailed examination reveals two astonishing facts. First, Ryōanji Garden, what we now think as the epitome of Zen, has been mentioned as something to do with Zen only as late as 1935. Second, this was done not by the Japanese, but by an American. Even the Taut text is written in a book written in English by a German author, though who wrote the actual sentence remains obscure. What were the Japanese writers and scholars doing all this time? There are some circumstances to be considered. First, it is clear from the records that Ryōanji garden was neglected, as apparently no priest was assigned to look after it. There is even evidence that children were playing in the garden. This old photograph shows that weeds were growing in the garden. Can't imagine it now. It certainly wasn't set up as a tourist attraction at the time. The second point, Ryōanji did not have a particularly high status even during the previous several hundred years. It was known and at times mentioned in guides, such as this one, where you could see people actually depicted again in the garden, so rather small in stature. I have here two official guidebooks of Japan, one in English from 1926 and another in German from 1939. And astonishingly, neither maps of Kyoto contain Ryōanji. The nearby Kinkakuji temple with a famous golden pavilion is in, but not our Ryōanji. Third, there was a surge of interest in stone gardens in Japan during this period. Foremost in this was the scholar and garden designer Mirei Shigemori, famous design, Tofukuji. He surveyed about 300 gardens in Japan and published the details of 245 of them in 26 volumes in 1939, and then published a 35-volume history of Japanese gardens in 1971. Amazing. He also created and restored about 200 actual gardens during his lifetime. Nobody has done anything like this before, actually I say also after. His interest for his own creation was focused on the stone garden style, and this eventually also contributed to the rehabilitation of Ryōanji garden. Fourth circumstantial point regarding the Japanese attitude towards Ryōanji garden is that there was a new emphasis on the spirituality of Japanese garden. The first one to proselytize this was Jiro Harada, we have already seen, in his 1928 book, The Gardens of Japan, where he puts spirituality right at the center. On page 1, he states, I quote, "The garden has come to constitute a necessity in life, not so much for the physical as for the mental and spiritual." End of quote. For Harada, this was of primal importance for the Japanese garden. He also importantly mentions that the influence of Zen was irresistible in all branches of art, and then discusses how this affected gardens. This is in a stark contrast to Josiah Konda's view of what a Japanese garden is about. We have already mentioned him as not illustrating Ryōanji nor Katsura gardens in his 1893 book. The characteristics of Konda's view of the Japanese garden is that he does not regard the spirituality of the Japanese garden as important. Even on occasions where he could have referred to the spirituality of the Japanese garden, he just does not do so. Konda's undervaluing of the spirituality of the Japanese garden is radically different from that of Jiro Harada, but is shared with that of Konda's contemporary Japanese writers on gardens. Again, we could see that the value system circles of Harada on the one hand, and Konda and 19th century Japanese writers on the other do not seem to overlap on this particular point. Another view of Ryōanji. After Harada, a number of prominent writers more frequently refer to the spirituality of the Japanese gardens in the context of Zen, and one of the most important to do so was, as we have seen, Daisetsu Suzuki, in 1934, which then possibly led to Loren Kak's connecting Ryōanji with Zen. What our examination shows is that the Zenness of Japanese garden was not a particularly important point of many of the Japanese writers. Of course, they all knew that Ryōanji temple belonged to a Zen sect, and many also commented on the merit or otherwise of a stone garden, but that is not the same thing with saying Ryōanji expresses the essence of Zen. Even when we examine the Japanese protagonists in the discussion, they show a remarkable transnational trait. Jiro Harada was really an expert in English language who was employed by the Tokyo National Museum. Miyuki Katahira's research shows that he was not a curatorial expert, but more of a frontman for overseas contacts for the museum because of his excellent English. Daisetsu Suzuki wrote all his major publications in English and has an American wife. Even Mirei Shigemori called himself Mirei, taking it from the name of the French painter Millet. He named his children Kanto, Kant, the philosopher, Cohen, Hugo, Victor Hugo, Goethe, is Goethe, and Byron, you know who is Byron. Who are kids? How did they survive their school days? Once Ryōanji garden got connected with Zen, this idea gets promoted more and more. As Yamada points out, Lorraine Kak in her 1940 book, The Art of Japanese Garden, devotes an entire chapter entitled Sermon in Stone on Ryōanji garden and gushes, I quote, "Undoubtedly this garden is one of the world's greatest masterpieces of religiously inspired art," end of quote. In her subsequent publications, she continues to make this point. Also in her 1968 book, The World of the Japanese Garden was probably one of the most popular books on this subject published in English. Even more influential than Kak in proselytizing Ryōanji garden was the artist Isamu Noguchi. For Yamada, Noguchi was the person most responsible for publicizing the rock gardens overseas. Noguchi was truly transnational figure. He was born in Los Angeles. His mother was an American. His father was a Japanese poet and writer Yonejiro Noguchi, normally known as Yone Noguchi. Yone was an important figure in the story of East-West interaction in his own right, but then he abandoned mother and child. Isamu and his mother came to Japan when he was 3, but Isamu then left for USA alone when he was only 13. His identity is essentially that of a Japanese American. However, he visited Japan many times and identified himself strongly with the art of Japanese Zen garden design, in particular with Ryōanji garden. Yamada details Noguchi's sojourn in Japan in 1950 in particular, and refers to Dora Ashton's monograph on Noguchi, where she writes that in preparation for the trip, Noguchi read and reread Suzuki's book, Zen and Japanese Culture, and books by Bruno Taut. We see a clear pattern emerging of a particular value system circle which appreciated Ryōanji garden and Zen culture spreading and overlapping. Yamada refers to an interesting and also revealing episode that when Noguchi visited Ryōanji for the first time in 1931, apparently he was not particularly moved by this garden. However, in 1950, his preparatory readings of Suzuki and Taut put him into a better position to appreciate the garden. Also, Yamada speculates whether Noguchi read Kak's 1940, The Art of Japanese Garden, with its eulogy of Ryōanji garden. Then, between 1961 and 1964, Noguchi created the Sunken Garden at Chase Manhattan Plaza in New York, which he called My Ryōanji, as it were. Here we could see the impact of Ryōanji traveling across the world to New York as an artistic reinterpretation of this garden. Now, 1964 was the year of Tokyo Olympics. We got another Olympics to come in Tokyo. I just started my first year at the university. I was once young, and was involved in it as an interpreter for the German TV. This was a truly exciting time for me. The austerity of immediate past was gone. The bullet train and even the motorway crisscrossing the landscape of Tokyo was a symbol of dynamism and even aesthetically pleasing. Yamada has an interesting article on that. A point I should like to make is that as a young student eager to learn more about Japanese culture, but also about Zen culture, I read Daisetsu Suzuki in Japanese translations. More recently, Suzuki is criticized as giving a wrong view of Zen to foreigners. However, as a Japanese student, in order to find out what Zen is, Suzuki was the guiding hand. It wasn't just the Americans who formed the view of what Zen is via Suzuki, but many Japanese also did so. This value system circle of Suzuki Zen we belonged had its own commonly owned authenticity, whether it overlapped with the more orthodox value system circle of Zen or not. This interpretation of Zen, which is almost more culture-based than religion-based, had a huge impact on Euro-American culture. I remember after I came to Basel in Switzerland to study art history in 1969, I was so often asked about Zen. There was really a lot of interest. This general interest in Zen also pushed Ryōanji Garden more and more into the limelight. Perhaps the artist who was most identified with the combination of Zen and avant-garde art was the American composer and artist John Cage. I was fortunate to be able to attend a seminar he gave in Basel so many years ago. Very exciting. To my surprise, he looked rather shy and nervous at the beginning, but gradually loosened up and became more relaxed. He spoke very warmly on Zen. To my mind, his 4 minutes and 33 seconds, his piece, where the pianist opens the lid of the piano, do nothing, closes the lid and goes away, is not a piece about silence, but to push one into a Zen-like heightened consciousness where you won't miss any sound which you previously switched off to listen because it was just noise. Cage has composed a piece called Ryôanji and also made drawings relating to it, as you see it here. This music is a major piece by him. There are other composers who also compose pieces relating to Ryōanji. And there is a quite haunting one on Ryōanji by the famous Finnish composer Kaija Saariaho, composed as part of her 6 Japanese pieces of 1994. There are several versions on the YouTube. If you are interested, you can listen to them. I have it on my iPhone. There's even an American guitar and saxophone group called Ryōanji Duo. Apparently, the name was given by a composer who wrote their first commissioned work after contemplating the temple's famous rock garden. Ryōanji as a modernist trope doesn't stop at music. Fun, right? You didn't expect that. Here is a piece which is part of the 2011 The Great Wall series by the Canadian artist Guy Laramé. The book with a blue cover is the most famous single-volume dictionary in Japan called Kojien. Another example here is a really strange piece by Shusaku Arakawa and Madeleine Gintz called Room, Sun, Ubiquitous Sight, Nagi's Ryōanji Architectural Body, an installation created in 1994 at the Nagi Museum of Contemporary Art in Japan. I chose this photo because you can see that person is not part of artwork. He's just enjoying the piece of art in there, wondering what it is all about. Right, I come near to the end. During the 1970s, the enthusiasm for Zen spirit into popular culture and other areas of art spilled into popular culture and other areas of art. The most famous is perhaps Robert M. Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, an inquiry into values published in 1974, which sold 5 million copies worldwide. It was really famous. People at that age would remember. And this title is actually a play on Eugen Herrigel's book, Zen in der Kunst des Bogenschießens, Zen in the Art of Archery, published in 1948. The Herrigel book gets more recently really like a bad press, including Shoji Yamada. However, this book is still part of the Suzuki Zen value system circle, as the copy I have contains a 1953 introduction written by no other than Daisetsu Suzuki, who praises the book as wunderbar. Maybe he's just been diplomatic. But what Herrigel is trying to do is to explain Zen through the martial art of archery. This becomes more or less commonplace even in the type of martial art a Japanese would not normally associate it with Zen Buddhism, such as karate or judo. So there is only a short step from the equation of martial art with Zen to the equation of martial art with Ryōanji. I apologize. As you see in this, I'm afraid, rather ghastly cover of a 1992 book on martial art. Ryōanji Garden becomes part of the psychedelic world of the imagination of an American karate master. I do actually own this. Okay. For the latter half of the 20th century, Zen seems to provide a variety of enjoyment and solace to people, from a cool fashionability to a form of spirituality uncoupled from religious ritual. Within this context, a Zen garden seems to provide a contemplative space away from a dystopian urban cacophony, and the place of Ryōanji as its epitome seems to continue for some time. Thank you very much.